Today we're going to talk about being a Sitecore architect in a composable DXP world. There you go. My name is Akshay Sura. I've been doing Sitecore stuff for quite a bit of time, been an MVP, and all I try to do is I try to make friends.
And my name is Kamruz Jaman, and I've been an MVP for 10 years. The British Cam, and now that Cam Figgy has joined, I'm the only and the real Cam.
So what is composable DXP?
So the past few years, obviously, been a lot of change for everybody. The pandemic has made us work in lots of different ways and have to adapt to a changing world. And in-person meetings in the Sitecore world have also not happened. We presented this at the SUGCON, so that was the first SUGCON in like over two and a half years. Was it 3 years by then? But the entire industry has changed a lot, and even within our Sitecore space, we have seen over the past year that Sitecore themselves have been buying up and acquiring a lot of different companies, and these are all companies which are headless and fit into what we call the composable DXP stack. We within Konabos, and myself and Akshay, we've been working with composable and headless for a number of years, since 2018. So we've had a slightly longer journey within this space than most others in the Sitecore world. So let's start off with explaining what a monolith or a traditional DXP system is compared to the latest and the greatest, which we call the composable stack. So we, within the Sitecore space, have been used to running with these traditional types of CMSs. They're monolithic in their approach. They do everything. So they will handle the content, and within you use their frameworks to build websites and systems. And that will include all of the presentation layer, all of the backend systems, all of the analytics, all of the search, the personalization pieces. Everything is driven by this one singular system. When you take a composable approach, you will use different systems for different needs and different requirements. These may be systems that you actually already use within your organization, or you will have to put these systems together and you compose your digital experience platform to meet the requirements and the needs of that specific project, that specific customer, and that specific industry. And transitioning to a composable DXP strategy, it will give your marketers a lot of freedom, a lot of creativity, and a lot of capability to build and deliver the digital experiences which they actually meet their needs. And increasingly, it is the analyst recommended approach rather than using the traditional monolithic systems. Gartner themselves have stated openly that you should adopt a composable DXP strategy to future-proof your tech stack.
Yeah, so like here, the biggest thing is that pretty much everyone, so the whole composable DXP thing started a few years ago, and moving towards a more composable DXP architecture may be the best way forward depending on your situation. And so one, it lets you pick the best of breed of things you don't already have. And that's very, very crucial to understand that this doesn't mean you replace everything you have. This means using what you already have, using what your company is most comfortable with, and doing it in a very agile way. So if you don't need personalization, don't add it. If you need a CRM capability, look for the best of breed and add it if you don't already have it. You don't have to do everything at once. So get the systems you need so it solves a business problem, and not the other way around where you're like, okay, I want to change this tool, I'm going to change it to another tool of a similar thing. That's not the mentality you need to have.
And equally, you can replace the systems which no longer fit your business needs. You're not stuck with an entire platform. You could replace individual pieces of this puzzle out if and when you need. And let's talk about Jamstack, because that's quite synonymous with talking with Composable DXP. So Jamstack stands for JavaScript, APIs, and markup. It's not a product. It's a modern architectural pattern for web development, and it's a way of delivering sites which is created statically, can be deployed quickly, delivered extremely fast, and scale globally. A lot of us have probably been working with some of these Jamstacky types of these Jamstack types of patterns in the past, but not to this degree. The idea is you create a markup, which is just HTML, and you can use whatever frameworks you want to generate that statically. You then create a set of APIs to deliver functionality and data that needs to appear on your site. So, maybe your account screens and your search pages or login, etc. And then you use the JavaScript to bind all of that together. So if you've done anything like a search page in the past, you may have used something like jQuery calling out to a search API, which will then show the results on the HTML page. That's the basics of the concept, except we're usually statically generating these pages beforehand in order to be able to deliver them extremely quickly, because at that point they're just static files as opposed to server-side generated files.
So why Jamstack, right? So everyone talks about Jamstack as this new shiny toy, and like Cameron said, this is stuff we've done 20 years ago, except that the interoperability or how easily we integrate with each other is much easier. So one of the biggest differences we've seen, and we ran about 11 projects last year for Jamstack projects, and one of the biggest things we see is cost. Cost pretty much everywhere you look, cost in terms of building, resourcing, running, DevOps, cost per month, the running costs. The best part is when we do like security audits on these sites, and it's super simple compared to how it used to be when you used to run like a .NET site and you run this security audit and you get a humongous list and you have to go through it again and again. I don't look at scalability at all. We just deploy, we deploy to Vercel. Once deployed, I really don't have to look at it whatsoever. So it's super performant. From a developer experience, it takes minutes to get up and running. No Docker containers, no crazy things. The only thing you have to worry about is a humongous NPM modules folder, but honestly, it doesn't take that long at all. Everything is very well documented. So most of these headless vendors for commerce or CMS or any system you look into, it's documentation by default. So they have APIs, you know exactly what you need to do. They have support where you can talk to them in minutes rather than days. So from like setup all the way to running everything from a developer as well as a usage perspective, it's super simple and super easy.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that really caught us when we started on this journey was the documentation and the extent of the documentation. There's no like, oh, I need to open up a set of DLLs and use .peek to figure out what's going on, because you can't. They're usually SaaS, cloud-based SaaS services. So I can't start going around and poking into our APIs. And if I did, I'd probably have a call from the FBI for attempted hacking or something like that, right? So these need to be documented and need to be documented well. There is simplicity to this because they are just APIs and they're usually just REST-based APIs. It's universal. It doesn't matter which language or system you've come from. APIs are APIs. Setting up devs for the first time is extremely quick, as Akshay mentioned. It's usually just a if you're using a node-based system, it's usually just a npm run start and hey, the devs are up and running because they're running against a SaaS system. There's no need to install much local software. And a lot of them do have free trials and services that you can sign up for. So along with the online services, online learning that a lot of them provide, which are free a lot of the time as well. It's easy for developers to get up and running, even if you're not on an active project with a paid service, or even if you're not working for a partner. That was how we got started, right? We just went up, signed up with these companies. We got ourselves a developer account. We ran through the training, we read the documentation, did a few POCs before we started really actively working on projects.
Another thing to really drive in is one size does not fit all. So it truly depends on the project you're working on, the client you're working with, the business, as well as the technology environment the customer is in to solve an actual problem. It is different. So you put two and two alike on the side, they will not be the same because you have to choose what best fits the need to solve the problem. So one size does not fit all. It will be dependent on the exact problem you're trying to solve, the customer you're trying to solve it for.
Yeah, and in our case, we started on our journey. I mentioned earlier that in 2018, and we were having a lot of customers that were not at that enterprise level necessarily, so they didn't have the need for the full Sitecore XM XP requirements. They wanted something a bit more basic, almost to a certain degree, right? They just wanted the one thing. They just wanted a CMS that did the CMS part really well, but they didn't want all the maintenance that went with it. And so we tried a whole bunch of different systems. We went through we come up with a list of requirements. These are the things that we must be able to do because some of these customers would be used to some of the functionality at least. And we did find like different systems would meet different requirements. And even on the composable projects we worked on, I don't think any one of them are exactly the same stack. They replace different systems with different parts as each one needs them. And some of them are already using these systems internally. And one of the, of course, the biggest dirty little secrets within the Sitecore world is, are your customers really using all of the features of XP? Sitecore is an extremely feature-rich platform, and if people do use it properly, it's extremely powerful. But the vast majority of the projects are not using all of those things that they bought the product for in the first place. But then, they saw that sales pitch and, oh my God, I can do all these like personalization and, based on targets, goals they've triggered and signups, and we'll do this and we'll do that. And at most, you end up doing some basic personalization, which is usually driven by some developers because they're like, oh, look, I can do something based on the GeoIP. But what value does that really drive the business in the end? And you have this huge platform, huge set of infrastructure costs, huge set of overhead from the knowledge that's required to implement this. If you're not using it, should you be running all of that right now and adding all this load on your teams?
So what does it mean to me being a Sitecore architect in a composable DXP world? So it's a tricky question because I almost feel like we have been a Sitecore architect in a composable DXP world because not all of our implementations for Sitecore do have other systems we integrate with. So in my mind, we're already doing quite a bit of this. The only difference is that in this case, in the composable DXP world, you're dealing with all the systems just talking to each other via APIs, and then having in the mix some things like Azure Functions or AWS Lambda things in order to coordinate between each other from webhooks to API calls. So it's a tad bit different in terms of how we're approaching composability from an architecture level, but I think we are partway there is the way I feel.
So I think before we dive in, I think it's important to discuss what the role of an architect is. And then Wikipedia describes it as a software architect is a software development expert who makes high-level decision choices and tries to enforce technical standards, including software coding standards, tools, and platforms. And I think one of the things that's typically happened in our space, especially, is we haven't really seen architects as being that high-level architects. They've been involved in the day-to-day grind of the project. So they're in there coding, they're acting like team leads or acting like senior developers, as well as also architecting parts of the solution. But we are seeing more and more that we work in these multidisciplinary hybrid tech teams that have lots of different skill sets. We have separate front-end devs, we have separate back-end devs, we have some full-stack devs, and each of those have a responsibility within that project pipeline. But as an architect, should you be actively coding? One of the concerns we have is, do I, as an architect, really need to know each piece of the tech stack 100%? Like, even within the Sitecore world, as an architect on a JSS project, do I need to know JSS inside and out? And do I need to know React inside and out? Do I need to know Next.js? Do I need to know Gatsby? Do I need to know the ins and outs of everything about Node.js, for example? And let's just consider this even from the Sitecore XP and the Sitecore XM world. How many of us these days really know that system inside out? Do I know the rendering host inside out? Do I know EXM inside out? What about the newer platforms like AutoCloud and Musand and the CDP? Maybe we as architects need to take a more holistic approach and hire the talent that we actually need to fit the roles and deliver for the customers better. The architect role is a bit blurred, so we should be able to look out for the technology that best fits the customer's needs rather than the technology that we know best.
So what we did is we kind of got together some Sitecore architecture diagrams. This might seem kind of familiar to you based on the projects you work on. It's pretty typical, right? So we have some delivery servers, we have content management servers and all the regular culprits of the Solar. We have code coming in from somewhere, built somewhere, deployed into these environments. And depending on if you have commerce or just XM or XP, it differs a little bit in how you deploy, but predominantly it looks pretty much the same. You have a CDN serving it in most cases. So these are typical Sitecore diagrams, but what I found interesting when I was looking through it for this presentation and our road mapping sessions is we typically deal with these external services and more. So like I don't think I even captured half of what all of us have done, but we always have the Sitecore projects with a bunch of other external tools, external vendors we deal with in order to do the integration. So in my mind, if we're already doing it, so this is the same architecture diagram with all the external tools in terms of what we do for Google Analytics or campaign management, pushing in and out contacts from other systems. So when I look at this, I asked the question, aren't we already composable then? Because I'm already doing a lot of work in the Sitecore space, but also dealing with all these external services. What do you think, Cameron?
Yeah, I think you're kind of composable, right? But you're hybrid composable. So one of the benefits of true composable DXP systems, or I don't know the exact definition of it, but the ones which we consider MAC compliant, right? Microservice architecture, cloud, and whatever the other acronym part is that they are API first driven systems, and they are usually cloud-based and SaaS. So we have a bunch of systems which are doing that, but then we also then have our Sitecore platform, which is none of those things. So we end up in this hybrid kind of situation where part of our system is composable, like the true composable, what we'd regard as MAC compliant, and then the main part of this platform is still using that traditional monolithic system. So you kind of have this hybrid approach. So what are the benefits of having a true composable DXP system? We are usually using we are usually targeting omnichannel, so it's not just the web. It'd be web, mobile, other systems which need data. Could be a TV, it could be a fridge. You know, we saw one solution which was actually taking data from a headless system and using it for content within a game itself. So it was giving users tips along their gameplay journey, which was an interesting use case, I thought. The composable systems are usually headless first, and they are API driven. They are what we consider microservices, and they are SaaS. SaaS has the benefit that it's scaled, it's globally scaled. The updates are done automatically. It's a fully managed system, and new features are automatically pushed up, and any bugs within the system are just automatically fixed. You don't have to deal with those issues. They are because by its very nature of being headless and API first, they are technology agnostic. You can use whatever you like to build your websites out of. That could be .NET Core, could be a JavaScript-based framework, it could be PHP, could be Ruby, whatever you like, whatever your team is comfortable with. You know, each one will have trade-offs, but whatever your team is comfortable with, you can build those. Typically, they are best of breed. They are doing one thing, and they are doing one thing really, really well. Find a system that works for you. No two systems are going to be the same. There'll be different benefits for your team. You know, you'll have certain requirements, and each of those systems will fill parts of those needs. You can also, one of the great things about using this approach, this composable approach, is you can actually avoid vendor lock. You're not reliant on one vendor for all of the pieces of the system. You can pick a vendor for the CMS part, you can pick another vendor for the commerce part, you can pick another vendor for the analytics part, and you can pick another vendor for your email system, email campaigns and email system. Use the vendor that meets that specific need the best, and then you just got to integrate those together. The other great thing about avoiding the vendor lock is not just the vendor from the point of view of the system supplier, also the system integrators. Again, it's such a simplistic system because of it being API driven. You don't need this heavy reliance on technology partners, right? You don't need a Sitecore partner only to do this. You can use, it just opens up the amount of vendors you have available to you as a business. That also keeps you, both the system vendors honest and the systems integrators honest as well. And it also gives you a rapid response to the business needs. It's a very, very agile approach. We found typically development is much quicker. Being able to start to use those systems and integrate those systems is a lot quicker. And once you know one type of these systems, it's very easy to get into and start working with another type of these systems. So once you know the CMS, actually the email campaign system is also going to be very similar. The commerce system is also then going to be fairly similar in their approaches and the approaches that you take to integrate those. So what are the disadvantages? So the biggest one we found was that these systems are not web specific. And I mentioned that omnichannel was an advantage, but equally that can be a disadvantage. Most of these systems are almost like you're throwing items into a Sitecore bucket, and then you're relying on filtering and tags and facets in order to actually narrow those pieces of content down. It will depend on your headless CMS, for example, but because content is not tied just to web, a lot of them will not have the concept of URLs or slugs or a tree structure for parts. Some of the vendors do have their implementation of tree structures and hierarchy. Some are implementing those, and some you can get that kind of view via add-ons. But typically in headless CMSs, that's not a thing. It's almost like I said, you're throwing lots and lots of items into a bucket, and then you deal with that from the code side and how you filter and return that. There are multiple systems and multiple vendors. When you have your Sitecore platform, that is the choice of your Sitecore XP platform. That is a choice of everything that you're going to use. You're not having to go out and look for a vendor for the CMS and a vendor for the email campaign system and a vendor for your marketing automation and another vendor for the search. You can end up with a bit of choice paralysis as a result of this, but once you've gone through that initial hurdle, go through, look at the different systems, try and figure out which few of those is going to work for you and your team, and then you can kind of stick to those platforms. I mean, there's loads of platforms out there, but we have only a handful of platforms that we really would be our go-to platform, unless a client had a very specific need, as in this is the platform that we want to use because that's the one we've already bought. So the initial hurdle will take a lot of time, but once you narrow it down, it's usually a narrow choice. The composable route also doesn't have any out-of-the-box functionality. As people who are typically used to Sitecore, we're also used to not having this. We've got a welcome to Sitecore page with which is built on web forms still, so we have really no functionality out of this. But a lot of vendors would have some sample sites and some starter kits that you can just go in and clone and get up and running with quickly. I know at SUGCON, Sitecore have mentioned that they are going to be providing more starter kits and themes and that kind of stuff going forward. So I'd be interested to see what they do. But it'd be nice if there was a SXA-like thing for this, where you can go in and compose a site out of specific systems already. But they do have some really good samples and some starter kits that you can get up and running with quickly. There are no dashboards like the Sitecore has its Launchpad, which gives you access to all the little parts within the system. Typically, these things don't exist with Composable. You'll have to go and build your own, and build if you need reporting and controls. You have to use some things to do that yourself. Within the Sitecore sphere, Sitecore is working on having this kind of Launchpad type thing for their different composable parts. So it'll be interesting to see what happens within our Sitecore world, and they've got some really good stuff coming up with that they had shown us in SUGCON. One of those was actually dealing with this next point, which is the lack of the visual editors. So not many headless vendors will provide visual editors. It's more like the content editor view we get within Sitecore. So it's just a bunch of fields that we're putting data into. You don't get that same experience editor-like approach, and it kind of makes sense when you think about it, because they are these omni-channel platforms. They don't know how you're going to use your data. The system you're building is sitting elsewhere. It's not integrated within the platform like your typical XP is. You're not building and deploying into the same system, but some vendors have managed to provide solutions for this. They'll provide SDKs for this, and Sitecore themselves are coming up with something to deal with this. And one of these things is supposedly going to be vendor agnostic, so you could use it with not just Sitecore, but other vendors like Contentful and Kentico Content and Content Stack, etc.
So in these slides, what we've done is all of the Sitecore architecture diagrams, we've actually replaced it with what they ended up being in the Composable DXP solution. So the main thing to note is we still have a website, we still have visitors, but because we're using something like a Vercel, we don't need an additional CDN like an Azure CDN or anything else in front of it. Everything is working off of each other. So like most of the time we are integrating directly into these systems for personalization, or if you're rendering a form, a search page, things like that. But the biggest difference here is in order for us to communicate with some of the systems, we have to use serverless functions, whether it's AWS Lambda or Azure serverless functions. It's totally up to you and your flavor. But whether you have commerce or just a Sitecore XP or an XM, you could supplement all of these systems or use something existing. So one of the things we found very interesting in all of this is when you're integrating in purely headless CMS, purely headless systems, because it's API first, you're writing a lot of integrations in Azure Functions. So we use Azure Functions as our glue between a lot of the systems. So if I need, public URLs for all the images in the DAM, we run a set of Azure Functions to do it. If we need to sync the SEO data between the headless CMS and the Cloudinary DAM, we use an Azure function. So there's a lot of interoperability in how things work by using either direct connections or using Azure functions. One of the things which we absolutely believe in, and this is what we follow when we are doing everything, is we do not look at it as a technology problem. When we get into it in terms of composability, we are not looking at, okay, we have Sitecore XP or a Sitecore XM, let's remove that and put a headless CMS. That's not the approach we typically take. So in our road mapping sessions, we're not talking about the technology problem you're having, but the process problem you're having. More than often, they're telling us things like, I have my products in the PIM, but I'm also having to put it in the commerce system. I'm also having to do this. I'm putting my images in my DAM, but I'm also putting it in the media library, things like that, process issues. So we look at it from a organizational or a business architecture level, look at it and then see if there's already technologies in place. So most of the time they're like, oh yeah, we have this widen DAM already, which we use for every other product function except the website. So we're like, oh, why not? We can use the same thing. So we look at it more from a business architecture problem more than a technology problem. And one-to-one replacement is something you should never do.
Yeah, and our typical development lifecycle has also changed as a result of the composable approach. So a typical Sitecore kind of approach, you take a phased approach to the entire project. You gather some requirements and somebody go and build some UX, and then and do the visual design. That would then get passed on to the front-end devs who build out a bunch of templates. The back-end devs would integrate those, and then somewhere down the line, just before you're going to launch a site, you get a bunch of people who rush in and try to build up the site and enter the content, and then somewhere way down the line, you may end up with this mythical phase 2 that we keep talking about, and you might get onto that personalization stage, right? What we found with the composable approach is it can all be shortened because we can run a lot of these stages in parallel. Requirements gathering, the road mapping sessions that Akshay just mentioned, the requirements gathering is still hugely important And I think that you have to pay a lot of heavy focus on that at this stage. Your UX and your visual design will still happen, but you can overlap those much more with the development phases. Your information architecture can happen way before, and you can start to build out your content models and your templates, and data entry can actually start to happen immediately as soon as you do that. You're using a cloud-based SaaS headless CMS. As soon as I start creating those content models, people can start entering content straight away. I'm not reliant on people entering content to be able to then deliver, for them. I don't then require the code to be in place for them to enter that content, right? Because they've started to enter the content, the front-end team can actually start to then build their screens directly off the content rather than just using building static HTML templates, especially if you're using a JavaScript based framework like React or Vue or Gatsby or something like that. And then your backend developers are typically doing those other pieces of work with the Azure functions and things. And again, they can be working all of this in parallel. If you have been using SXA at all, then this kind of stacked approach will be very familiar to you, because you can have this kind of approach with SXA using their wireframing theme, for example. You can start to build your information architecture very early. They can start to enter the content. The UX is done based on the wireframes, and then the front-end devs can go in and start to build out the CSS and create your variants and that kind of thing, and the back-end devs can go in and customize the little bits and pieces that they need. And then going forward, you can actually just add the features that you need and the services that you need as of when you need them, rather than having this big system just sitting there consuming resources and developer time to maintain when you're not even using this.
So like the next one, it's a bit annoying when we talk about content modeling, because to us, this is a new word which is being thrown around, especially when Composable came about. But this is something we've all been doing. So content modeling in our world is creating those data templates, the visual templates, tying it all together, template inheritance. How exactly are we going to store a specific piece of data for a specific item is basically what we've been doing. So content modeling isn't anything new. The only difference in this world from a content modeling perspective is you try to keep it channel agnostic. So most of the info you need, which keeps like an author or a blog post or a news item channel agnostic, you do so. Anything channel specific, so if you need something for your mobile device, you need something for your web page, you store that separately so that you're not clouding the main piece of information, which is trying to be omni-channel. One of the other things which is also super important, so we've played with it for so long with the composable products all over the place that whether we like it or not, the experience editor is the nicest editor we've seen. It is slow, it is a painful piece of software, but at the end of the day, if you really look at the benefits of it, right? So it's customizable. We get to do a lot of things with custom actions. We get to do the renderings, personalization, all of that fun stuff, which is really good. But when you go into the composable world, you'll realize that it is not that. So there are a few things like Builder.io, StackBit are two pieces of software which let you do a lot of the page editor kind of thing, but they're not page editor. They're not experience editor. There's another thing called Web Spotlight by Kentico. Again, it is like experience editor, but it's nowhere close to being the customizability of an experience editor, right? So you just have to keep in mind that when you're talking about visual editors, you're immediately talking about channel specific content. So composable by default or by nature is omni-channel. So we're taking omni-channel content and expecting visual editors, which almost is making us think back into just a web channel, right? So we just have to keep that in mind. Headless CMSs try to segregate things, right? Like they decide to separate storing of the content, parsing of the content, providing the content, and they're not responsible for how it gets displayed. They don't really care how the visual part of it does, just like Sitecore. With Sitecore, because it's a monolith, it knows how the data is and how the data is supposed to look like. So that's the difference, is that in Sitecore, we have the content as well as the layout very close to each other. In a headless CMS, it has the content. It really doesn't care how the content is going to look in a specific channel.
Yeah, and I think that was still one of the biggest hurdles that we had to get through, right? Because when we started looking at these samples and examples and the starter kits and things, all of the content models were based on very template-driven pages. And this, for me, having used Sitecore for so long, was something we had moved away from since Sitecore 6.4 when they first launched the old page editor. Before that, we'd have, everything would be template driven. You go into the content editor, you create something from a template, you have a bunch of fields, you put the data in, and the page will look what the page will look like. You can't, and then from the page editor onwards, we would be able to go in, we could add a component, add a new data source. So it's a different way of working. You do get used to it. There are workarounds for this, though, which will come with experience. That was one of our main requirements, and we had to figure out different ways of working in order to solve this problem for our customers. And it's still not experience editor level, but we haven't had anyone have issues with being able to create pages how they want and for them to look how they want with different sets of components. Sitecore is working on something I mentioned earlier, the new tool called Symphony. It'll be a Sitecore front end as a service. So they should, they'll be tying together their own sets of products, but also, so I mentioned it'll be multi-vendor and an open kind of product. So in theory, we'll also, you can just buy this one little component and tie your other pieces together. So it'd be interesting to see how they come up with, I think it's supposed to be based off Horizon, which was, compared to the experience editor, it was fast, it was snappy, it was modern. So obviously a few more bugs still to iron out and a few more features to add. But that will be a great piece going forward.
And composable doesn't necessarily mean it's composable in page editor or an experience editor. So that's another thing which we have to keep in mind, especially for Sitecore customers moving to a more of a headless approach.
So moving forward to what does it mean to be a .NET developer in the composable world? Because we've all been there. I still do a lot of development within the Sitecore space. I've done little bits of React in the past, but I'm not a React expert, right? So typically we're having people within the Sitecore space probably asking themselves, if we move into this composable world, am I going to be made redundant? What role am I going to be playing within the team on all the composable sites written in JavaScript and React and Next.js? That's, these are the things we keep hearing about these days. Can we even do Jamstack using .NET Core? I think it's important to distinguish between Jamstack and composable. These are typically used interchangeably almost, but they are not the same thing. So Jamstack is the architectural principle for building sites, statically generated sites specifically, and composable is the use of different systems to build your digital experience platform. That's a composable DXP. You can do one without the other. So I can build a composable DXP system using just regular old .NET system. We typically, .NET can be an integral part of your stack. We mentioned earlier, we use a lot of Azure functions. So that's typically where we do a lot of Azure .NET work. Azure Functions can be written in multiple different languages. Same with AWS Lambda, and even things like Netlify and Vercel edge workers. They typically would be written in things like JavaScript again. But depending on your team, you can have .NET be an integral part of your system. We typically, even in Sitecore XP, we have multi-skilled teams already, especially if you're using a JSS kind of approach. You already have a split between React developers or JavaScript developers and back-end C# developers. And we typically were agnostic developers before we were working in specific CMS-only systems. I've been working with Sitecore platform since 2010, but for 10 years before that, I had never worked with a CMS system in my life, and I'd never even heard of Sitecore before I had worked on my first project. Right, I was just a .NET developer, right, or a full stack developer, right. We didn't label ourselves as a technology specific developer, and going back to being an agnostic developer, you will probably find that it actually opens up your job prospects a lot more than being just a Sitecore developer. And then with .NET, you can, so with the Composable, you can choose whatever systems you like to build with, whatever languages you like to build with. You're just working with REST APIs. You've done this in the Sitecore world, right? You're probably integrating with a lot of backend systems from your .NET code with APIs. But if it's just APIs, you can call that from any language, right? JavaScript, .NET, Java, Ruby, PHP, probably even AS400 if it has a webhook, a web client on there. And you can actually build jamstack sites using .NET Core. There is a framework called Static, and take a look into it. The concepts within that are actually kind of familiar for us Sitecore developers. You have a set of pipelines, and within the pipelines you have a set of modules, and then your static HTML generation will run through these pipelines and then through each individual module, and then at the end of it you'll get an HTML page, and then you can deploy that out to Vercel or Netlify or whatever hosting provider you're using, Azure static sites on Azure even. But just be a little bit careful with this framework, particularly at the moment. Myself and Akshay, we're not React developers, we're not JavaScript developers. So we had actually looked at this, and it worked really, really well as a proof of concept. So when you have these static site generations, every time you make a change, it will go off, it'll kick off a process in the background, and it will run through all of these pipelines, and for each page, it will generate the markup for this. And that worked great for 10 pages and 50 pages and 100 pages. But when you hook that system up to a headless CMS, those 200 pages quickly become 500 pages, become 2,000 pages, become 5,000 pages. And unless you've got some way of controlling this, it is going to be a problem, because your static build time generation goes from a minute to 5 minutes to 30 minutes to 2 hours. And the last thing you want is a content editor making a change and then them having to wait for 2 hours for that change to be visible on the site. It's just not realistic in this enterprise kind of world. Frameworks like Next.js get around this by having a concept called incremental static regeneration. So it will wait until a request for a page comes in, go and build that page, and then cache it. And then it will time out after a certain number of time. You can usually control that. And then if you want, the next time it's requested, it will just serve it straight from cache. And we're kind of used to this with Sitecore, right? We have these HTML caches in place, and the publish will clear that HTML cache. So you could, in theory, do the same thing if you have a pure .NET Core app, right? You'll come in, the page gets requested, you can go and then build that page up exactly how you want it to, serve it to the client, serve it to the user, and then cache it. But then, of course, you're going to have to then get into like cache clearing logics and that kind of thing, and having to deal with separate caches and having to deal with clearing those caches yourself. And then, of course, we know that when it comes to clearing caches, that's probably one of the hardest things in computer science, right? Of course, in the Sitecore world, is picking icons.
Yeah, and one of the things, as we've been mentioning, is static sites, whether you do them in .NET Core or Next.js or React or whatever that is, it does need some handling just in terms of being API first and headless. There's a lot of things you need to do. For instance, you need to clear the cache when something gets published. You need to generate a list. You need to have functions to pull and push data from systems, kick off webhooks to create a build. All of that, you can do it via serverless functions. You can write serverless functions pretty much in anything nowadays. So we use quite a bit of Azure functions. We host and deploy using Vercel. We could write node-based serverless functions in Vercel, but again, everything comes at a cost, right? It's all based on how much data you process, how much data you pull and push, how many times you're invoking the function. So based on what you're most comfortable with, for us, we run hundreds and thousands of these every single day. And for us, Azure Functions made sense from a budgetary perspective as well as from a technology perspective. So we have a team which just deals with Azure Functions from index building, pushing product data, order data, and all of that fun stuff. But you could do it. So in AWS Lambda, you could still write .NET Core functions if you like, or you could write node-based functions. So similar thing with everyone else as well.
So as a result of all of these changes, the way we request our page changes, right? So in a typical Sitecore page request lifecycle, the user requests a page, it'll probably go through some sort of traffic manager or CDN. The Azure server will handle that request, and you will then go through a set of pipelines, and it will, call up, you might call some custom databases, you might call some external services and some other custom applications, and then you build the HTML page, and then that will get returned to the user, the final product. The lifecycle with the jamstack approach changes. So we are pre-generating a lot of the pages or using incremental static regeneration. And what that means is the user, when they request the HTML page, when they request the page, they are just given an HTML page, typically from the CDN. And that's the only thing they're getting. Everybody gets the exact same response. Then anything else that needs to be added on top, you will layer that on top. So if you need to call some composable services in order to get some more data for that user, you use the JavaScript part to call the APIs part, and then supplement the content on the page. And you can equally call Azure or whatever serverless functions in order to provide more customized responses. So the only constant in life is change, and that's more so in IT than anything. I've been doing Sitecore for 13 odd years. Actually, it's been doing it longer. I don't think that the core part of the platform has really changed. I know we've had a lot of different services added over time. Things like OMS came, and then DMS came, and XDB came, and then the email campaign manager came, marketing automation came. all of these things are being added around the core part of the platform, which has been pretty stable over probably the last 15 odd years. But in IT, it's always a case, change is always guaranteed, and it's never a case of if, but when that change is coming. So we need to embrace that change. It will. We need to keep up with these technology changes. We've all gone through these changes. I started my life as a static HTML developer, and then I moved on to doing ASP 3.0 or classic ASP. Then I did web forms, did MVC, and then now we're heading more in the composable direction now. But it's important to find your stack, find the sets of services and products that work for you. A lot of you have been already doing this, even on that Sitecore platform. I've typically been integrating with lots of different external services, a hybrid approach nonetheless, but the concepts are almost exactly the same. It's extremely important to focus on the client and the project needs. Technology is no longer the barrier, and it's no longer going to be the restriction for we can't do this because the technology does not allow for us. If it doesn't allow for it, find the stack that will allow for it, and then reach out to the community, reach out to us. We're all going through the same journey. Somebody may know an approach that will work for you, or at least just impart some advice and say this works for us or this didn't work for us, equally as important. The beauty of Composable is you can pick and choose exactly what works for you and what works for your client at their given part of their journey. We've been talking for a long time. So we'll take questions. I know there's probably a lot of information there to digest. So yeah, please, if you have any questions.
While people think of questions,
Hey.
Paula was in one of these. So we have a thing called as a DX Cafe where we're trying to do things for people. Again, it's not related to business or anything like that, like Toastmasters Club and having like exclusive webinars and things to help people develop their technology skills, leadership skills and things like that. So if you're interested in it, please do sign up for it. I mean, it doesn't cost you anything.
And we also share a lot of our knowledge and around the composable DXP approaches as well. So worth joining if you want to just get a bit more knowledge as well.
Questions?
Hi guys.
I have a simple question. And as an office or a company that is kind of like a partner of Sitecore, do we, as architects, do we always have, because we have the tendency to recommend Sitecore products or solutions, right? And in terms of budget, sometimes the clients have to pick between implementing the current solutions that they have or migrating into Sitecore products that are quite similar with theirs. If working with the current product that they have will take time, do you recommend migrating into a Sitecore product instead? Or yeah, I think that's a question. Or do you always have to propose or promote our Sitecore products? Yeah.
Because I want my MVP next year, I'll say yes. But no, you don't, and you also don't actually have to migrate, right? If the Sitecore platform is working well for the customers, stay on the platform. Not everybody has an issue with the Sitecore platform. The Sitecore's own approach right now because they know that a lot of people aren't using a lot of the functionality within XP, is move the clients onto XM, because that's not a big migration at that point. They can go from Sitecore XP, not using analytics, ditch it. Not using EXM, ditch it. Not using the marketing automation, ditch it. Go back to the core functionality of the CMS and what they are doing and use XM. Then when they do need the personalization, go in and add in Sitecore Personalize. When they do need some additional data enrichment, use the CDP. If they need to use EXM, then go ahead and use Moosend or CycleSend, as it's called now. That's probably the easiest approach for the vast majority of customers to go towards a composable route. They're still on this hybrid approach, admittedly, but it's going to be a much simpler solution for and set of infrastructure and reduce costs. And for your own teams, for your own development teams, it's not a huge shift to, there's no shift at all. You still can build your sites in MVC or JSS or whatever you're building, and your team structure right now changes, but it gives you a good route to get onto the composable future.
Got it. Thanks, Cameras.
Hey guys, this is Venu Mustafali. Thank you both for sharing all your experience so far. I have a quick question on, so I do understand that the challenges to implement Composable DXP do vary by each client's use case. What was the most common challenge you ran into? Like, for example, performing current state analysis and recommending the client on appropriate composable stack, or custom pricing analysis, or identifying some resources and skill set gaps, things of that nature. So I was wondering, what are the most common challenges?
Challenges are hard to find. There were a lot of easy things. Finding developers was easy. Vercel was easy. I didn't have to look at my Octopus deploy and wait for deployment into my app services for like 30 minutes. Our deploys take about 3 minutes at the most. Challenges, I think, is just the mindset change. So we had a couple of customers who had a ton of websites on Sitecore XM, and they had to move to more of a headless. And the challenges we spoke about, which is losing the experience editor, knowing how things were in one system, moving them to another system. So each of those challenges had their own kind of solution. So the good thing was the headless system they went to had a good online free courses for their staff to pick up things really fast rather than having to figure it out themselves. But I think the page editor was one of them. For us, the biggest challenge from a headless perspective was, no matter how much we say headless and composable, the reality is that we still cater to web more than anything else. And the biggest challenge was having the hierarchy of the pages, which not all headless CMSs do. Thankfully, the CMS we chose did have a hierarchy. So I knew who the parent was, who the children were. So you can do the path that way. But those were a couple for me. And I'm sure Cameron has some on his mind.
Yeah, I think some of the bits, I think we take granted some of the things that are built into Sitecore. Search being one of them, right? So that was a big challenge for us initially, was figuring out, they want search on the website. How do we deal with that now? Because typically in Sitecore, it all lives together. The data is there, all within one system. We have the indexing pipelines. We can go and customize those. We can add custom fields, computed fields, and that kind of thing. We now have to deal with that as an external separate problem almost. And it was those kinds of things of how do we get this integration? How do we build those systems? But once you've done that once, it's the same, doesn't matter which sets of vendors you end up working with. It's just relearning a few things that were built into the system previously, and now we have to break those out.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Any other questions? Oh, wait.
So we've got one through. If it's the greenfield project or a rewrite of legacy, would you recommend to switch to headless JSS or stick with MVC? Greenfield project from a Sitecore. So if you're sticking with, yeah, it's going to depend. I think it's going to depend on your team. So if you're going with Sitecore JSS, you're going to have to see what your team makeup is. Are you going to go with JSS as in React, or are you going to go with headless services and the .NET Core rendering host? And then the Sitecore's headless approach on the old XM XP isn't the typical headless composable way of doing things, because you still have all of your layout information and things like that, which is good to a certain extent. JSS is, if you're gonna switch and you don't want to stick with MVC because you want to go that way, then personally I think JSS is a way to go, because you can then use Next.js and use statically generate those sites and host it out to something like Vercel and Netlify, something like that. It will depend on the project, because if your project is just a very much North America or country specific target audience, then I don't need global scaling at that point, right? So do I really care about the CDNs and being able to have a statically generated site that I can scale globally? Other customers of ours are truly global, so they have a multi-site implementation, and some of the customers are in Japan, and some of the customers are in North America, and some of them are in Europe. So it does need to scale. Yeah, it really is going to depend on your team's makeup. You can still stick with MVC and go the Sitecore XM route, and then use some caching on top of that, right? You can still take that static kind of approach by using a CDN on top and just caching the entire HTML response. And you can still follow a composable approach, where if you're using something like Marketo or HubSpot for the forms, right? It's on a static page and it's just using JavaScript to actually put that form on that page. Don't use the Sitecore Forms module. You can also then use something like Uniform or Sitecore Personalize when that's fully released, to go and personalize those pages. Again, you're still responding with a statically cached page from the CDN of your XM system. Does that make sense? Yes.
Yeah, thanks for that. Okay.
Okay, great.
Any more questions?
I just have some suggestion and things. I mean, not suggestion, just little things. So I do like a Sitecore XP natively with personalization and things like that. I never did anything with Jamstack or any of the stuff, but still I could able to connect to the presentation very well because of the comparison between the typical Sitecore approach and then the Jamstack approach, and being realistic with me knowing that you both are in Sitecore for so long, and how you switched it, and with some personal information with where you started and where you went, OMS, DMS, I could like very well able to connect. Without it, it would have been like, yeah, I mean, something they're talking about, maybe, I mean, it doesn't stick into the brain. It's really, really helpful to see how you have transitioned and helping us to transition. It's really good to see that. Much appreciate coming in and presenting to us. And a quick suggestion as well for the Toastmasters Club. I signed up for it, but I couldn't join because of the timing. It would be really nice if it is after hours or something. This is like really much more needed space for the Sitecore developers because of public speaking, a lot of things. I even thought about like joining an improve class or Toastmasters club locally, but when I saw it, I was like, oh wow, it's really exciting. And it just, the timing was a little harder. I mean, I wanted to make it consistently, make it so it just, if it would have been in after hours, would be great. Just a quick suggestion.
Yeah, thanks for the kind words. Yeah, appreciate the feedback, and yeah, we'll take the feedback on the Toastmasters back as well, and hopefully we can make the time work for.
It was pretty good. I didn't want to miss it the other day. I was in 2 meetings. It was about to reach out to Dennis to mention that, like, hey, try to keep it in off hours, like somewhere around 4 o'clock also, it will work. It's like mid of day, I was in client location, but still I didn't want to miss the meeting.
Yeah, no, I just gave him the feedback so they can work on it.
Awesome.
Hey guys, Akshay or Kambuz. This is another simple question again, but I would like to ask you for like the mindset that Sitecore architects would have if, say, for example, we do not know what like DAM is or CDP, although I have worked with DAM before, or EXM, and then there is an immediate need for the clients to implement such a thing. What would you recommend to have the proper mindset to be able to still implement the best services out there or products from Sitecore or from anywhere else? So yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the lines Cameron's mentioned, which is super important, is, and it's hard, right? So I'll mention the line first. So look at the client problem you're trying to solve and find the best technology solution for it, rather than finding a solution based on your technology knowledge. And that's a very critical thing to think about. And it's hard because depending on the company you work for, the process is, if you're in the Sitecore practice, your job is to just push every piece of software which Sitecore sells to solve that problem. And unfortunately, some of these companies say, okay, you want to look at Marketo. Marketo is another department. They do their own sales, they do their everything. You stay within your bounds is what the companies do. But if you do have the freedom, the best way to do it, and like Cameron's mentioned, none of us can know everything, right? So we might know what DAM is, we might know what the purpose of the DAM is, but if we wanted to do some customizations on widen DAM, for instance, none of us would be able to do it. But the best way to do it is to talk to other people. Just say, hey, you know what, I'm looking for, this is what, and that's the beauty of the Sitecore community too, is everyone is willing to help. So you could say, hey, I'm having this issue. I know I need to solve it with the DAM. Can you guys recommend, based on your experiences, something which will solve this problem? Maybe there's something specific in terms of a peculiar thing the DAM needs to do. I'm sure people will jump in and help you out, or any other technology you're looking for.
And if the client says they want to use EXM, I think the only solid approach is to pray that you have some hair left at the end of it and you haven't pulled it all out.
Yeah, there's this customer that would like to send emails, like 1,000 or sorry, 100,000 emails a day. And I was looking at the contract from Sitecore, and it's a bit expensive. So I was thinking, what if we create some like an email server, and we can send emails ourselves for free?
Yeah, I mean, you can. Yeah, you can. Right, with the Sitecore one, you can use a custom SNTP server and not have to use Sitecore's one. But there's a lot of things that go into that, right? It's not just as simple as setting up an email server. You know, you have to deal with bounces and unsubscribes and dealing with your typical, restrictions around the sender IP addresses and things like that. There is quite a few things that go on around that. Whereas if you're using a cloud-based SaaS system, you're like, I need to send 100,000 emails. Well, none of that is my problem. You scale your system, to deal with me sending 100,000 emails and you handle all of the responses. I don't want to deal with that. That's why I'm paying you. So, I mean, if you're stuck in the EXM world, then unfortunately you have to deal with it. Pete Navarra has a lot of good blog posts around that. He's one of the few people that have been able to scale EXM to that kind of level. But typically we've found that a lot of customers have been staying away from it and using the tools that they're most familiar with and their teams are already familiar with.
All right. Thank you so much.
Just want to add one more thing on the same aspect. In my case, one of our clients, they have Salesforce Marketing Cloud. They don't want to use EXM, although they have XP. They just want to use that. Any emails, they said we have to go through Salesforce Marketing Cloud. And also they had the personalization option in Salesforce. And the funny part is we have a Sitecore XP, but the personalization is done in Salesforce. It gets injected into our XP homepage. So kind of composable, but if they already have the contract in place and it's being widely used by the company, why just go and say we will set up EXM and do all that stuff? Just use what's standard.
So in your particular case, Bala, you could jump down to XM and you're still not going to be any different, right?
That's the path I'm just recommending them. Like, why are we running this XP with all this overhead? Just do XM.
Yeah.
You just.
And I was speccing out for a customer the other day, and XP had like 16 different services, roles that you needed to install. XM had 5. Right? I've got to pay for that hosting cost, right?
So they are asking themselves, are we really using personalized? Are we using goals? And whatever you mentioned earlier, they are just going through that and we are just listing out, is this really worth running it or just a switch? Seems pretty quiet. Any more questions, anyone? I think we are a little bit over. Thank you for extended time and sharing all your expertise. Jamie and Akshay, as always.
Thank you guys for having us. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Next one. Bye.